What sets modern civilized history apart from prehistory is that our history is written. We record in writing our progress through time, achievements, and milestones for posterity. The Hammurabi Code, the Ten Commandments, the Bible, the Quran, these are all written records of sacred laws from the ancient world. American democracy, too, has a lineage of written records that show the development of our nation. Each document builds on those before it to make our foundation of freedom stronger. Our foundations of a free society, a free republican form of democracy, began long before America was founded. This is Documents of Destiny, Foundations, and the Colonial Era. In our program, we have 4 subject matter experts. John Smolensky, Associate Professor of History, UC Davis.
Many of the colonial charters granted the same tracts or parcels of land to different colonies. William Penn fought for years with Lord Baltimore over the boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland.
Robert George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program, Princeton University.
The copy of Magna Carta we have displayed in the National Archives was a gift to the United States by Ross Perot, the businessman and politician.
Wilson Smith, Professor Emeritus of History, UC Davis.
John Locke, as a person, before we talk about his ideas, was an interesting fellow. He came from what we call middle-class family in southwestern England, and his father was a small-town attorney.
Priscilla Zadi, Professor of Political Science, United States Naval Academy.
The Constitution of the United States is really the application of a collection of old ideas. And all of those old ideas had to exist before the Constitution could have been a reality. It's impossible to imagine the Constitution would exist today had we not had the Declaration of Independence, the Magna Carta, the Mayflower Compact, a number of documents which talked about limited government, consent of the governed, the contract between citizens and their government, and all of these culminated in the United States Constitution. But clearly the Constitution would never have been written when it was in 1787 without all of those other documents before them.
And among those documents was the Magna Carta. Magna Carta is Latin for Great Charter. A charter is a written instrument or contract. It's also a guarantee of rights, franchises, or privileges from the sovereign power of a state or country. The Magna Carta was written in 1215, during the reign of King John. The Magna Carta is one of the earliest examples of people exercising their rights under a monarch. It was written by rebellious barons who were fed up with the difficult demands placed on them by the king. Here at Runnymede, just outside London, King John signed the document and brought to 13th century England greater freedoms. The Magna Carta contained 63 chapters or clauses that demanded from the king various liberties. In effect, it limited the powers of the monarch and laid a foundation for the protection of the natural rights of the individual and of constitutional government. Taxes were not to be levied without the approval from the people, and their representatives were the ones who made those decisions. And it was Chapter 39 of the Magna Carta that established the right of the accused to be given a trial before sentencing. It stated, "No free man shall be taken or imprisoned, or in any way ruined, nor will we go or send against him, except by the lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land."
Chapter 39 of the Magna Carta is significant for Americans. It talks about procedural and substantive due process. And the language in the Magna Carta, which is the law of the land, that language has been interpreted by American courts to mean due process of law. So the first real inklings of due process, the idea of fundamental fairness for all before a government, originates from the Magna Carta.
Another concept we've inherited from the Magna Carta is the right to a speedy trial. Chapter 40 from the Magna Carta says, "To no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice." In the years leading up to the American Revolution, colonists angry with the British for crushing their rights turned to the Magna Carta for inspiration in their fight for rights. Today, as we read the United States Constitution, we can see the influence the Magna Carta had on our founding fathers. Provisions written down more than 7 centuries ago continue to protect the natural rights of Americans. The Mayflower Compact. In 1620, a group of separatist Puritans, later known as Pilgrims, left England to escape religious conflict. The ship they sailed on was a 3-masted merchant vessel called the Mayflower. Weeks later, after enduring many hardships, they landed on the shores of Massachusetts' Cape Cod Bay. There they embarked on a new life in a demanding new environment. As a form of law for the new colony, the leaders of the Plymouth colony penned the Mayflower Compact.
The idea of a compact or a covenant, which is almost used interchangeably during this period, is the idea that a group of, and in this case men, agreed that they would be bound by a document that would create their own civic politic. And its significance is a first attempt at self-government, the idea that they would govern themselves and not be governed by Great Britain.
On November 21st, 1620, 41 men signed the Mayflower Compact. The agreement established for the first time on our shores a self-governing colony.
We whose names are underwritten solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic.
These early documents were not signed by women. Women were not really included as part of the body politic. Men, white landowner men, were considered those that were responsible for running the government and deciding about it. And women just at that time were not included.
Historians differ on the significance of the Mayflower Compact to the evolution of the American system of government. Some highly regard it as the first Constitution, while others hesitate to accord it that much power.
The Mayflower Compact surely was, when we think back to that, a constitution in a way, but it was only for a group of very small, tiny religious believers, a band of exiles from England, self-imposed exiles, of course, who thought they were founding a heavenly city in a way, a city on a hill. And that was an agreement, but it was an agreement with the Almighty, with God.
Really, to call a Mayflower Compact a constitution, though, to give it that kind of importance, is giving it far too much importance. While it was a very important document in helping the Pilgrims establish their community, their little commonwealth in New England, it's really unlikely that they would have thought about it in anything similar to what we would think of as a constitution today. In the 17th century, the term constitution did not mean anything like what it means today. It was surely very important to them in establishing some of the ground rules for shaping their commonwealth. Far more important for them in doing that would have been the religious principles that they lived by.
Their belief was really the cement of the contract, nothing written. They agreed among themselves in the Mayflower Compact to behave themselves, to conduct their lives in a religious way. But it was belief that held us together and made up the compact.
Two Treatises of Government. When one looks back on the origins of American democracy, among those our founding fathers looked to for guidance was a political theorist by the name of John Locke.
John Locke was a British philosopher who lived in the 17th century. His thought was critical to our founding fathers because he was interested in the theory of republican government, and particularly on limitations of government. So the idea of limited government, although it did not originate with Locke, was highly developed by him.
Locke believed all people were born with certain rights, and that the role of government was to protect those rights.
Locke was concerned about natural rights, that all individuals had rights that were not given to them by a government, that didn't accrue to them by being part of a systemic grouping of men, but were rights of man that existed in nature, that accrue to you by being human, and that those rights included things such as ownership of your own property, ownership of your own goods.
In 1690, after years of developing his theory, John Locke published his views in a major work called Two Treatises of Government.
The first of his two treatises basically concerned criticism of the idea of the divine right of kings. He criticized those who held that the king ruled by divine right and that his power was more or less unlimited, at least unlimited with respect to humans. He was answerable to God, but not to other human beings.
Gone is the idea of a divine right of king to encompass all power over his subjects. Gone is the idea of fealty or loyalty to a certain kind of overlord or magistrate or king. Locke says, well, we talk about Locke the revolutionary. He was a very legalistic revolutionary. And he does say in the Treatise on Government, you can get rid of a king very slowly, with plenty of legality, and with consensus of all concerned.
In the second of the two treatises, Locke was operating more in an affirmative mode rather than just criticizing existing theories. He was developing a theory of government of his own, and it was a theory of limited government and of republican government. Locke proceeded from the idea that we can think about man as being in a state of nature prior to there being any government. We're human beings living as individuals or in families or small clans. We have certain natural rights to our life and to our liberty and to our property, but without government in place, those rights can't be protected.
The structure of government in the second treatise on government is laid out by Locke. He says that when we leave the state of nature, we do that all naturally because we're social beings. We combine with one another. We get together and we have what he calls voluntary associations. These voluntary associations become civil associations in civil society and what we call government, from very elementary, primitive beginnings in a tribal form coming down into monarchies and republics.
John Locke was among a group of political theorists who promoted what was called a social contract theory. These social contract theorists developed the idea that government exists because people contracted with each other to be governed by a certain set of rules.
Locke saw government as orderly, as a way in which people would flourish with some structure and organization. Some of his ideas are still tenets of our system of government today, the idea of life, liberty, and property.
Locke agreed that we need government to protect liberty. The state of nature isn't good enough. We need to create government to rectify the deficiencies of the state of nature, but that even when we create government, we still retain certain rights. There are certain rights we don't turn over to government. These rights are unalienable. We cannot, as a moral matter, give them away. As a moral matter, we retain them no matter what.
Other philosopher theorizers of government had talked about justice, about peace, about duty and obligation of citizens, about the structure of government, but no one had talked about it in terms of liberty. And Locke comes along and stresses liberty.
Locke was interested in the social contract as the idea of what gets us from a state of nature where there is no government, where people have rights but their rights are unprotected, to a circumstance where we have government to protect people's rights. The social contract gets us from here to there. It's an agreement that people enter into with each other about the terms under which they will live together.
Supporters of American liberty embraced John Locke's theories. His idea of limited government can be found in the system of checks and balances laid out in the United States Constitution.
One of the distinctive contributions of the American Constitution is the idea that government can be divided so that we have institutions exercising power to check the power of other institutions, what we call our system of checks and balances. Fundamental to our system of checks and balances is the idea of a sharing of powers, a division of powers, a separation of powers. For example, the executive is separate from the legislative. This is different from the parliamentary system, such as the English system, where these two branches are in effect united. A prime minister is actually a member of parliament and elected by the parliament. Well, in our system in the United States, our founders have bequeathed to us a situation where we have a president who's separate from the Congress, an executive separate from the legislature, and they check each other. The president simply can't make laws without Congress. He can propose, but it falls to Congress to actually legislate.
Another document in which we clearly see the influence of John Locke's theories on the founders is the Declaration of Independence. In the most famous passage of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson wrote,
"We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
Jefferson said once that one of the three greatest men that ever lived, one was John Locke.
We Americans believe in unalienable rights, that there are rights that we have not as gifts from the state or from the legislature or from the executive or from a king, but rather rights that come from God, that are God-given rights, that are natural rights, that we didn't get from government, and therefore government cannot legitimately take them away. They are unalienable, and therefore government's obligation is to respect and protect them.
It's fair to say that Locke's principles have stood the test of time in the United States. Locke's appreciation of the importance of the consent of the people to their government is one that we Americans continue to cherish. In Part 2 of Documents of Destiny, we'll take a closer look at the Declaration of Independence. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts. Some documents of destiny that contributed to the development of our nation came to us from Great Britain. But during the 1760s and 1770s, the British Parliament provoked colonial unrest when it tried to impose new taxes on the American people. Those documents of British taxation included the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts.
Well, the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and the Townshend Acts were acts that are significant because they galvanized Americans against certain kinds of egregious governmental behavior. So they're significant documents because they indicate the limits that have to be placed on government, such as no taxation without representation.
After the French and Indian War, the British government was deeply in debt and needed assistance from its American colonies. The method they used to raise the money was taxes.
In the first part of the war, the French had victory after victory, and the British were very nervous and said they were going to tax the colonies more. They'd always been taxed. They just never really collected much revenue from them, allowed them to keep their own revenue from certain portions of the tax. So the tax was nominal before.
But now the British were determined to get their money. The Sugar Act placed an excise tax on sugar and molasses, which made goods with these ingredients more expensive. The Stamp Act taxed all printed matter, everything from newspapers to diplomas. Colonists were required to buy a stamp for all printed documents. And the Townshend Acts levied import duties on glass, paint, paper, and tea.
But what comes out of those three acts is the idea of the contract of consent, that there should be no taxation without representation. And given typical custom, given usage, given the fact that the taxes had been there before and never really imposed heavily, all of this led to an egregious reaction by the colonists. They were absolutely opposed to the idea of paying these taxes.
Colonial resistance was swift and intense. Assemblies gathered in protest, passing petitions and resolutions. They organized boycotts against British goods and refused to use stamps or stamped paper. There were also street demonstrations, mob protests. Tax collectors were harassed, and other unrest that eventually led to the Boston Tea Party. Among those fighting for the colonists' rights was the great political activist and Boston patriot, Samuel Adams.
If we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it.
This crisis finally came to an end in October of 1765, when the colonists held a Stamp Act Congress, which issued a Declaration of American Rights and Grievances. On March 18, 1766, the British Parliament backed down and repealed the Stamp Act.
What comes out of that is so significant is the idea of not being taxed without being represented. That if you're going to tax them, they should have had a voice in the body politic which created and levied that tax. So that idea of taxation without representation, that battle cry that you hear that leads to things like the Boston Tea Party, that's the significance of those acts.
The documents of destiny that recorded our steps toward liberty would not be complete without the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress. Between September 5th and October 26, 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. The colonial delegates met to show Great Britain that the colonies were united in their opposition to taxation without representation. Although united in their demands for rights, their views on Great Britain were divided into two camps: those that favored making peace with the British Empire, and those calling for greater independence.
We sometimes think of the American revolutionaries as men who had no doubts. But as a matter of fact, they came to revolutionary ideology, in many cases reluctantly, in some cases never free from some doubts about it. They certainly thought of themselves as Englishmen, and what moved them to criticize the Crown and ultimately to break from the British Crown was a sense that their rights as Englishmen were being violated by the Crown. Only a few years before the Revolution, men like Washington had fought for the Crown in the French and Indian Wars. Certainly, in those days, they thought of themselves not only as loyal Englishmen, but loyal to the King. It was only as time went on, not a great deal of time, maybe 10, 12, 15 years, that they began to perceive the Crown as oppressive. The King was not treating them as full and true British subjects and citizens, having the rights of British subjects and citizens, but treating them as subservient. And this really is what stoked revolutionary sentiments.
By the end of the Continental Congress, the delegates had produced many proclamations, but the one that would really upset the British Crown was a resolution called the Declaration and Resolves. Signed on October 14, 1774, the Declaration reaffirmed the loyalty of the colonists to the British Crown, but it also declared the rights and established principles that all the colonies held in common. In particular, the colonists asserted that they had the right to free and exclusive power of legislation in their several provincial legislatures. In other words, the colonists said they were free to make laws in their own colonies, regardless of Parliament's position.
What the Americans who would become revolutionaries began wanting was not revolution, but reform. They weren't trying to establish a new regime, as the French revolutionaries would a few years later. They wanted a restoration of traditional rights. This is why the American Revolution is sometimes called a conservative revolution. It's contrasted with the French Revolution, which was a revolutionary revolution trying to establish something new, to break an old order.
Upon signing the Declaration and Resolves, the delegates to the First Continental Congress rallied the colonists to place a ban on all trade with Britain. They then voted to meet again the following year if Britain did not attend to their grievances. But Britain did not. Parliament and King George III viewed the Declaration and Resolves as an act of defiance that they could not tolerate. The king revealed his state of mind in November 1774 in a letter to Lord North.
The New England governments are in a state of rebellion. Those must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent.
Determined to reassert control over its colonies, Britain sent soldiers to intimidate the Patriots. On April 19, 1775, British soldiers and American patriots faced off in Lexington, Massachusetts, firing the shot heard round the world. The American Revolutionary War had begun. American representative democracy has a lineage of written records that reveal the development of our nation. Each document builds on those before it to make our foundation of freedom stronger. These are the documents of our history. These are the documents of destiny.